Following President Trump in the news over the last little while has prompted me to make some observations that I wanted to share. But before we begin, let me start by explaining what this is and what it is not. This is not any kind of diagnosis of Trump or a comment on any particular psychoses or comorbidity from which he may be suffering. It's not a diagnosis of his cognitive or mental state, and it doesn't explain any specific decision he has made or his decision making process. It's also not about Jane Austen or her classic novel. It is, however, some observations on how Trump perceives threats, how he generally deals with these threats, and perhaps explain his rather one dimensional problem solving approach. So here we have Trump in the middle, and in that first circle are the things that Trump perceives, those things that impact him or seem to impact him or his family directly. And then the outer ring is the things that impact the things that impact Trump or his family. So there's a cause and effect. It's not always what we see, and we see some of the examples around here. So the number of COVID-19 cases, example, reported in the U.S. The criticism of him, for whatever reasons, by political opponents, perhaps even allies, and constructive criticisms. The number of corona deaths reported. The Black Lives Matters protests all over the country that, again, producing more bad publicity. The economy in decline. So all kinds of things, the poll numbers being down, all kinds of things that affect him directly. And then if we look back, the numbers of COVID cases, for example, are actual people getting sick. The number of deaths reported are actual people dying. The Black Lives protests are actually about Black lives and not about making him look bad in front of the country. The economy is being impacted greatly by the COVID crisis, of course. So there's been lockdowns. There's been people who they want to be back to work, but they also don't want to get sick. They don't want their kids to get sick, heading back to school. They don't want their parents, grandparents to get sick and die. The poll numbers are just are really just all of those things put together, that lack of effective response, and the systemic racism within law enforcement that he doesn't recognize. So all of these things are the things that affect those things that Trump feels and sees. But he can't see those because they're behind what I refer to here as a curtain of ignorance that basically prevents Trump from perceiving anything that's not directly impacting. So you can't see the things, you can't see the root cause of things. And so this curtain of ignorance really limits his response to solving these problems. He can't solve the problems. He can't solve the root cause of the problems. He really can only address the symptoms that he sees. He's like a doctor who is treating the symptom and not the underlying condition. So it's like a doctor who is treating a broken leg with aspirin, right? He's only treating what he can see. You can't solve an issue if you aren't aware of it. And this is why Trump can't formulate plans to fight the pandemic, have an open conversation on systemic racism, have empathy for the dead, the dying, deal with any type of protest, or deal with criticism of himself or his policies, whether they're constructive or not. Just want to bring up an example of one of the statistics that Trump brags about to do with COVID-19, and that's the death rate. Now, most sources indicate that the U.S. is doing very poorly when it comes to keeping people safe and preventing death from COVID. But Trump will say that the U.S. has the lowest death rate. They're leading the world in that, um, according to him. And from a recent interview, we saw how he's measuring this, the number that he's picked, because it's true. They are, and when you look at this number, it is quite low, and that's deaths over the total number of cases. So deaths per total number of COVID cases. And the reason that this number is so very low right now is because um, there's been so many cases of COVID that these deaths have not yet caught up. And really, these deaths over total number of cases, um, it doesn't really measure anything at all. Again, it's just a number that's lower that Trump could point to talk about success or his success, but it doesn't measure the success of the federal response. It doesn't measure the success of the hospitals or the public health workers, what they're doing. It really just it's just a lower number, and because Trump, again, that curtain of ignorance preventing Trump from seeing that these are real people dying, uh, he it can only solve the number because that's what seems to be bad for him or seems to be what's hurting him. So he thinks, he truly does think that if he solves that number, if he can make that number look better somehow, that that people will will thank him, will praise him for what a wonderful job that he's been doing. So really, a better way to measure this would be case fatality rate, which is the deaths per the total number of resolved cases, and where the resolved cases are either recoveries or death. And so that number uh, is is something that we can actually compare all countries, all places, much on a much firmer footing. So in the long term, this way of measuring deaths over the total number of cases, when the daily case rate, slows. I mean, it was up to 75,000 or more at one point per day. It's come back down a little bit now, but when it gets down to a more manageable rate, the number of deaths will actually increase, um, and eventually they will match in the long term. They will match the case fatality rate because in the end, everybody's going to recover. I mean, when this is beaten, so there'll be a certain number of deaths, and there'll be everybody will have an outcome. A total resolved cases will be those deaths plus those recovered. Now, this number is not going to, the total number of the deaths over the total number of cases is not going to approach this until much later. So whether or not Trump is still in the White House, this could very well be an attacking point. As these numbers go up for Trump and maybe Republicans attacking Democratic governors, or maybe if there's a different body in the White House, it will certainly give them ammunition to to attack, because that number, that deaths divided by total number of cases, will increase, and it will simply just be, well, if Trump's not there to when that number does move up, it will just simply be an attacking point for him or other Republicans. Now, really, when we take this all together, the curtain of ignorance, um, and how Trump goes about solving the problems, there really is a limited number of things that anybody who's not in his immediate circle of influencers can do. The media is, typically can't do it, but the media can help, I think, simply by um, not presenting these unimportant things to him, to Trump, so that he can solve them. The federal response has been now, how do I fix the death rate? Well, I do that by changing how we measure it. How do I fix the number of people who are sick, the case rate? I spin that. It could have been much worse if I didn't do, close the border to China in late January, or say how testing is skewing the numbers, making him look bad, that kind of thing. Whenever the media or his political opponents question Trump on his response to the pandemic, they point out the number of cases and the number of dying and other statistics. But now, understanding this curtain of ignorance, perhaps instead the questions they need to ask are, how can the federal government help those people who are still healthy from getting sick? What action is the federal government taking with state governors to prevent the spread of COVID-19? Can the federal government create some strict guidelines for back to work protocols and force state officials to have plans that follow them? That last question should be especially appealing to Trump because it has some key words such as strict guidelines and force state officials. These are concepts that he seems to like to employ and with which he believes he's had success. Now, it would be incredibly naive of me to assume that asking a few questions in a different way would, at this stage, make any difference in Trump's responses to all of these issues now facing the U.S. And also naive of me to believe that these observations of Trump are more than just that. One person's attempt to explain why Trump is so focused on the things he is focused on, why he utterly believes that he is providing viable solutions from the U.S.'s most powerful political office, despite consistently missing the mark on the true problems. You can't solve an issue if it's hidden behind a curtain.